And now it is my pleasure to introduce our newest president, who's been working so hard since she took office. Please welcome June Blanc. Thank you.
Thank you, Joan. Sounds like great programs coming up. I am June Blanc. I am very excited to be involved with this wonderful organization. On your screen, you will also see the other members of our planning group. You very quickly, I think many of them you know well, or a couple of them you know well. You know Don Shields very well and Tyler Beebe, who've been presenting guests to you for many years. Naomi Marrow is our newest member. I beat her by 1 week. So in any case, we've got a great team, and we've been working very hard. So the mission of the Foreign Policy Discussion Group is to expand knowledge and understanding of key global challenges, including confronting the United States, whether they be from countries or broader issues, such as water scarcity, as we will hear soon. Our format, in case you don't know, is that our presenter will speak for 30 to 40 minutes, and we will then follow up with a Q&A. Because we're on Zoom, you have to ask your questions in the Q&A, and I will read them to our speaker. So please do enter. This is a complex topic. I know you will have lots of questions, so please take advantage of being able to talk to an expert directly or through me reading the Q&A. And let me also remind you that our program is recorded and it's archived for future viewing, and to find it is on the front page of chappaqua.library.org. So before I turn the program over to Don Shields, who will be introducing our guest, we will be talking about water scarcity. Let me leave you with some statistics from UNICEF to put a little context on what we'll be talking about. 4 billion people, almost 2/3 of the world's population, experience severe water scarcity for at least 1 month each year. Half of the world's population could be living in areas facing water scarcity by 2025. Some 700 people could be displaced by intense water scarcity by 2030. And by 2040, roughly 1 in 4 children worldwide will be living in areas of extremely high water stress. So with that, Don, would you introduce our speaker, who will then talk about how we're going to address some of these issues and prepare for them.
He's going to solve all our problems, I hope. So on your screen, you can see Aaron Wolf, who is our presenter today. As June has introduced, we're in the area of water resources, and in particular, the coming to agreement with your neighbor countries on the sharing of water. And if you look on Zoom and try to look at water conflicts, then you can see a goodly number of them on rivers such as the Nile, with Ethiopia building a dam, and also in the Himalayas with many countries, Pakistan, India, China, all of these border countries coming together to try to understand how they can share the water resources. And the other one of interest to me on the West Coast here in Canada is the Columbia River Treaty, which is being, in a way, renegotiated between the United States and Canada. So right on our own border, we have water sharing issues and power sharing in this case. So our expert today is Aaron Wolf, as I've said, who is a professor of geography in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University on the Oregon coast. He has an MS, Master of Science in Water Resources Management, and a PhD in Environmental Policy Analysis, both from the University of Wisconsin. Aaron Wolf's research focuses on issues relating transboundary water resources to political conflict and cooperation. He has been involved, for example, in developing the strategies for resolving the water aspects of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Aaron's training, combining environmental science with dispute resolution theory, has been particularly appropriate in such matters, as you may imagine. Wolf is a member of the American Water Resources Association, the International Water Resources Association, and is an associate member of the International Association for Water Law. Join me in welcoming Aaron Wolf to Chappaqua at 7 a.m. I thought would be his time, but no, he's cheated and is in the middle of the country and not too far away from us in time. Take care. Thank you, Aaron, for being with us.
Awesome. Thank you, Don, for that really generous introduction, and to the whole team there for making this happen. Of course, the group there is well known, well outside of New York, and the fact that you all engage in the difficult issues of the day is inspiration to well, to all of us. And so I'm grateful for the chance to be with you. I'll try and share my screen. As Don mentioned in this generous introduction, my background is both on the scientific side of water and on the human side, and I think this is true of a lot of people in this world we call hydro diplomacy, that people kind of get in thinking they want to help through better technology, more efficiencies, and then you get in a room and you have a room full of angry people, and you say, hey, people, you don't have to be angry. I've figured out what the solution is. And for some reason, that just makes them angrier. And so for me and a number of people, that then sends us back for, well, how do people work? How do you have a conversation around something as vital as water in a way that people can listen to each other, people can talk to each other, and actually get to a place where they can even think together about the technical side. So our main problem is kind of two worldviews, as exemplified by these two maps. We have the map on the left showing watersheds, just the boundaries of the watershed. If I'm right, you guys are in the Hudson watershed. Is that close? Yes. So within a watershed boundary, everything is connected to everything else. And so what's emphasized in this unit are the connections: surface water, groundwater, quality, quantity, all the people, all the ecosystem that are tied to water are all connected in this unit. And then what happens, of course, is people slice that up into state boundaries or ethnic boundaries or national boundaries. And so we're trying to manage the water as if the world looked the way it does on the left, recognizing the very legitimate reasons for those boundaries to begin with. And a number of years ago, people started to notice that people who don't like each other very much share watersheds, and started to make the link. So in the 60s and 70s, people started to notice the Arab-Israeli conflict had water aspects to it. The Nile Basin is shared by 11 different countries. Upstream countries are developing, downstream countries are concerned. Same in the Tigris-Euphrates. Turkey's building dams. Iraq is very concerned about that. India and Pakistan share waters, and they have a very tenuous agreement. And then currently in the Aral Sea Basin, the upstream countries are hoping to develop. The Aral Sea is drying up, and the downstream countries are losing their agricultural production. And so there was at the time a kind of headlines around the wars of the 21st century will be about water. And this is about the time that I start to look and recall that I was trained initially as a scientist. And so my question was, what do we actually know? People are kind of cherry picking these 6 case studies, and they're saying, look at these people who hate each other. They're sharing water. Therefore, there's going to be war. And just intuitively, you feel the story has to be a little bit more nuanced than that. And what I was curious about was the global experience. So we started to put together a database of all the world's treaties and recorded instances of conflict and cooperation, and really started to be much more systematic, especially on interactions between countries. We found every reported interaction between countries and put it on a spectrum of conflict to cooperation. And simply by doing that, I think we got a much more nuanced story of what's going on. So here we are from very intense cooperation to war. And you notice that two-thirds of the time we do anything over shared water, it's to cooperate. And if you look at the basins that we named, sure enough, there's cooperation between Arabs and Israelis, Indians and Pakistanis, Azeris and Armenians. In all of these very, very tense locations, people oftentimes are willing to talk about water when they won't talk about anything else. And sometimes will come to formal legal agreements that then survive even as there are conflicts over other issues. So famously, India and Pakistan signed an agreement in 1960 that survived two wars between the two parties. And even in the middle of the wars, India was making payments to Pakistan as part of their treaty obligation. So this idea that we can use water as a vehicle for dialogue, even in very tense places, was a part of the story that simply wasn't being told. If you look at the conflict side, you'll notice 80% of this is nonviolent conflict. This is mostly two sectors. It's politicians playing up the conflict side. We will protect the lifeblood of the nation from the foreign enemy, or it's the press playing up the conflict side, because that's what the press does. If you look at actual violence, there's actually very little across international borders over water. 38 cases of small-scale violence. 27 of these were between Israelis and Arabs, but the last violence on the Jordan specifically was in 1970. So it gives you a sense that even though there are tensions, and of course, these horrific, June started us with all these horrific statistics about people suffering and dying without access to clean, safe water, and all of that's true. It's a massive humanitarian crisis, but it doesn't seem that people shoot at each other as a consequence. And so if you look at the number of wars, you'll see 0 wars in this 60-year record. And in fact, you have to go back 4,500 years to the only documented war between nations over water between the city-states of Lagash and Uman, which would lead one to believe, oh my gosh, everything's great. Negotiations are breaking out all over the world, and we have no problems. And then the World Bank has these models about how, as you increase in cooperation, the tangible benefits that you're able to generate can grow. And so as you're sharing hydropower projects, and you're sharing road networks, and you're sharing infrastructure, that the benefits of integration start to grow. And then at the end of the day, the argument, we're still left with a question mark. If cooperation brings so many benefits, why isn't there more of it? As I said, there's very little violent conflict, but there's also very little active cooperation. So of our 310 international river basins, more than 60% have no treaties on them at all. And even when they do, they're unilateral agreements. That means pairs of countries rather than the basin as a whole, meaning that the water can't be managed efficiently. Why is this the case? Well, people. All these processes are resolved by small groups of people in a room who oftentimes are really, really angry with each other, oftentimes have a lot of history and baggage. And so what we learned to do in the hydro diplomacy world is to think along these two axes. This is Ashok Subramanian, from the World Bank who came up with this. We're used to looking at the horizontal axis of economic benefits and costs. And the idea is the more benefits you can generate, the more likely you're going to get cooperation. But the truth is the people who make the decision about whether to cooperate or not themselves as individuals need to benefit. And that means that's the vertical axis, that the political opportunity versus the political risk of cooperating is huge. So take US and Iran right now, that even if there were a project that could generate a huge amount of resources, the inertia that it would take to overcome the political risk to cooperate are so great that we're not likely to do it. So thinking about these two together is the field of hydro diplomacy. What can we do in the water field, and how do we make it politically viable for the people who have to make those decisions? So some of the lessons that I've learned as a practitioner and as a facilitator. One, process is everything. You know, I was trained as a scientist. All you do is you optimize, you can quantify, and it just doesn't matter. The managers throughout the US West, for example, report they spend 50 to 100% of their time managing water conflict, and they're not trained in it. They're trained as hydrologists and engineers and economists. The higher the level of management, the more time is spent on managing conflict. And so recognizing that as we're managing water, we need to be managing these processes. And there are two different approaches to it. The groups that are thinking about this at all are kind of divided in two. There's the whole security establishment, Department of Defense, CIA, militaries all over the world are looking specifically at where the conflict's going to be. And they're thinking about them in terms of military strategy. So applying big technical monitoring or solutions or building things, or just recognizing that a conflict might break out from a security perspective. And in contrast, there are the water people who are thinking about how do you have better conversations. If there is the possibility for tensions, how do we preclude that? How do we get the water people together in what we call the track 2 or track 3 space? How do we have conversations around water in a way that might influence the political process? So this is happening. And so what I've learned to do, certainly when somebody says a war is going to break out over water, 9 times out of 10, as I said, it's a politician or a journalist saying it. And what I've learned to do is call the water people and say, what's going on? And again, 9 times out of 10, they'll say, we got it. It's not, we're just problem solving here. There's a little bit of tension, but we see what the solutions are. The process is not rational. Again, I was trained as a scientist, and I was initially, when I went in to study alternative dispute resolution, this was the model that was prevalent at the time. Fisher and Uri getting to yes. A lot of you may have seen this. And for a scientist, this is wonderful because it's so logical. You separate the people from the problem. You focus on interests, not on positions. You invent options for mutual gain, and you insist on objectivity, right? Leave all the emotions at the door, leave the history at the door, leave the baggage at the door, and just sit down and have a rational conversation. And then I get out and start to do it, and it doesn't work. If you think about the last dispute you had, maybe even with somebody you love, was it a rational process? Could you both sit down and quantify what it was that you need and figure out how do you come to some kind of an optimal, quantifiable agreement? You don't. These things happen in relationships or in negotiations, in fits of what I call the transformative moment, moments where suddenly people are thinking very differently about each other. There's a lot of tension in the room, and suddenly somebody compliments somebody on the other side, or somebody listens to somebody on the other side. And those kinds of gestures are spread around the room like wildfire and can shift on a dime the whole course of negotiation. Part of this is how we sit. If you think about seating arrangements, we sit face to face in one of the worst psychological positions to have a conversation. But if you look at how we pray around the world, it's always side by side. So you're taking this energy and you're turning it into this energy. So how do we take that to have better conversations? Sharing our vision about what the future could look like, help us identify in a very real sense, what are the values that we share about the basin and the water, giving space for venting. Listening, to my mind, is one of the key skills in facilitation that we are inordinately bad at teaching. A lot of us have been exposed somewhat to active listening, but there's so many deeper levels to listen, not from the head, but more from the heart, in a way that connects, and in a way that when somebody's talking nominally about water, maybe they're talking about their history or the loss of a farm or the loss of a way of life, their livelihoods, or the need to migrate, or any of these other deep traumatic experiences. And the last thing anybody's looking for is a rational, quantifiable solution. So at some point, this book that I wrote came about because I was really taken by the experience of people in faith communities and people in very local and indigenous communities that had generations or millennia of experience in these transformative moments. And so what I set off on, what ultimately was a 14-year quest, was to understand what can we learn from these communities when people are facilitating from a place of faith or within a local culture. What are the tools that they use that have proved useful over the millennia, and how can we bring these into our negotiation setting? And that's this book here that I wrote, I think, about 5 years ago, the spirit of dialogue. So the kinds of things that are useful, again, if we look at the very local communities, oftentimes there's a balance of the needs of the self versus the needs of the group. And this is a question I use a lot in facilitation. If somebody's being very belligerent and wants a lot of stuff, my question for them is, if you get everything you want, what would be the impact on the community? And that really is what negotiations are about, is facilitating or balancing those needs. Well, in the Middle East, there's a process called the sulha, ceremony of reconciliation, where when somebody does somebody wrong, they come to them under a flag of humility, and they ask permission to be reintegrated into the community. And it's based on the two competing elements, rights and honor. And the concept of tarhdin, resolution of a conflict that involves no humiliation, is something that I think we in the West could learn from. Regularly, I've seen, for example, in Bedouin law courts, where the judge would say, you know what, you're right, but how can we walk out of here where the other side can also make a living to protect their family? A lot of places around the world are rediscovering these processes that maybe the mask of modernity had superseded. So in Singapore, there's this Kampung spirit, the kindness movement, where they have these community mediation centers set up within the apartment blocks, and they've been able to resolve 70% of cases that come to them, leaving the courts for the more serious win-lose. Just some other lessons on approaching these issues. If you get stuck on a problem, reframe it. So often these problems are set up as competitive, as win-lose. Either Ethiopia gets to build the dam or Egypt gets its water. Either the rancher gets the water or the environment gets protected. And every time we see these dichotomies, simply reframing it to ask the question, how can both sides get what they need becomes a critical exercise. A lot of folks have seen this kind of exercise where you get a picture like this. What is this? Is this an old woman? Is this a young woman? And the answer is yes. They're both in there depending on how you see it. And that's true of water. Ethiopia wants to build the dam. Egypt needs water security. So the question is, how can upstream countries develop while protecting the needs and rights of the downstream countries? Same in the Aral Basin, on the Amu Darya. Countries upstream want to build dams. So it's not, is it this or that? It's how do we meet the needs and interests of both sides? And same within countries. This is out my way in Oregon. Ranchers are at the forefront of doing environmental restoration because they've figured out that a healthy fish run in a healthy environment is more useful to them, more interesting to them. They all fish. And they all want a healthy environment on their land. So they're figuring out how to do environmental restoration while making sure that the ranches thrive. If you get stuck on a problem, make it bigger. How do we mean by that? So Don mentioned the Nile Basin. It's really complicated. And for years and years, development agencies thought that if you only had enough information, if only you had data, if only you had enough tech, everybody would just come to agree. And that almost never works. And finally, they invested about $10 billion in data and monitoring and tried to put a treaty together that was ultimately stuck on 3 words that represented, or 4 words that represented the entire upstream downstream divide. And so if you look, the upstream countries agreed to this language on the left, I'm sorry, on the top, where they agreed that development should not significantly affect the water security of any other Nile Basin state. Egypt countered, not adversely affect the water security, and then here are the 4 words, and current uses and rights. Those 4 words signified everything to Egypt. They have 11 countries upstream of them. They are deeply, deeply vulnerable to anything that happens upstream. And for them, without some kind of a guarantee of their historic uses, would make themselves too vulnerable. So if you get stuck, and then this was exemplified when Ethiopia started to build their Grand Renaissance Dam right here on the border. And for a while, there was a huge amount of tension. The BBC caught some generals in Egypt saying, well, why don't we just bomb the dam? Which, as a strategy, I don't know how many vets we have in the room, but if you're downstream, you don't blow up an upstream dam. That water has only one direction where it's going to flow, and you don't want it flowing back on you. So if we look just at the dam, we have a lot of problem, but can we zoom out and make the problem bigger and the benefits, the basket of benefits, bigger? For example, the dam is on the Blue Nile. Here, what if we also look at potential efficiencies on the White Nile? Are there ways that more water can be generated there that might ease some of Egypt's concern? Or if you scale out entirely into Eastern Africa and you think about road networks and energy grids and trade, can you develop a package that's just so big that the dam itself loses the intensity of the dispute? The other alternative is making the problem smaller. So here, what we really want to ask is, what do people mean by the terms they're using? And even water can have several different meanings. So here, there's a little small territory right in here on the Jordan-Israel border. And when they sat down to negotiate a peace treaty in the 90s, they both recognized that the border had shifted by about the size of a football field, that Israel had been kind of taken Jordanian land and was farming, and had been farming now for some 30 years when they sat down to negotiate. And so at one level, you look at this and say, oh my gosh, how do two countries agree to share this, to split the same piece of land? And that's what you would think. This is a zero-sum conflict where one side gets the land and the other doesn't. And so now we really break down and think deeply and in a nuanced way. What does each side want? On the surface, they both want the land. Dig a little bit more deeply, Israel wants to farm. Dig a little bit more deeply, Jordan wants sovereignty. So now the question isn't how do two countries share one piece of land? It's, can you come up with an agreement by which Israel continues to farm and sovereignty goes to Jordan? And in fact, you can, and that's exactly what they did. The land went back, the ownership of the land went back to Jordan, and you see their flag flying there over the strip of land. And then Jordan, from a position of strength, turned around and leased the land back to Israel for 25 years so that Israel could continue to farm. And then when the 25 years were up a couple of years ago, the land went back to Jordan entirely with no intensity at all. Finally, there's a truism in the facilitation world. The issue is never the issue. When people are talking about water, a lot of times people, especially on the outside, think they're talking about water. Let's just give them more water. But there's four kinds of water. There's the physical water, the water that you move, you carry, you touch. There's the mental water. If you're thinking about the price, the crop per drop, the efficiencies, these are the waters that we in the West are very comfortable talking about. But there are other waters as well. There's emotional water, water tied to history, water tied to sovereignty, water tied to power. Think about relations with the tribes out here in the West, that when we're talking about water, we can immediately be talking about 400 years of history. And in the Middle East, much longer than that. We're talking about spiritual water, the water that is in all of our faith traditions as a role in spiritual transformation. And what's interesting is in our kind of post-Enlightenment West, we've separated these two worlds so that in public and in public discourse, we're really comfortable talking about the things that we can measure and deeply uncomfortable talking about emotional and spiritual water, but that may well be where the root of the conflict is. Without recognizing the importance of history, of rights, of sovereignty, we oftentimes can miss the actual issue. Finally, we approach water really badly. If we want people to get excited about it, and I think that's us and the sciences doing a disservice, we think the only way to get people's attention is to scare them. So Don brought up the Columbia Basin, and sure enough, we're negotiating a new agreement on the Columbia between the US and Canada. And this is what scientists do, say, oh my gosh, the fish are dying. And it's true, the fish are dying over the years. And oh my gosh, climate change is coming and it's changing the hydrograph and there's more snow. All of this is true. But I think the more scared we are about more things in the world, the less fear is a motivator. And I wonder if it wouldn't behoove us just a little bit to think about why we like water to begin with. And this is how we often engage with water. We love it. We love being around it. We love playing in it and swimming in it and boating on it. Property values go up the closer you get to water. So recognizing that there is an intangible attachment to the resource, unlike to other resources, gives us, I think, an advantage in thinking about how to engage populations with the resource. So there's river festivals all over the world, and you know, you got a dancing catfish there, right? Yeah, that's going to generate so much more interest in a watershed than any of my graphs trying to scare people. And the kids are playing and looking for bugs, and even at the international scale, there are these huge river festivals all over the world that really you know, bring together the art of the river and the poetry of the river and the music of the river and the peoples of the river. There was every year there's a Stockholm Water Festival. It's Water Week. And it used to have two components. It used to have an academic component with a lot of PowerPoints and presentations. And then they had a festival where people just went out and pretty much drank. And the second part got too rowdy. And so they just squashed it. They stopped doing it entirely. And I'm like, really? That's all you have left are PowerPoints? That's how we're going to persuade people to engage with the watersheds? And finally, I think this idea of keeping faith out of the room that we've done in the West is a disservice. When we're talking about something like water, we need to use all the tools we can to help elevate the conversation. And if we can bring faith into the room in a respectful way, in an egalitarian way, I think it can help elevate the conversation. So here in the West, oftentimes we're welcomed onto tribal land and in prayer, and there's generally very little objection to that. And I think if that's done well and tastefully, it can start. In the Middle East, we would start with a priest, an imam, and a rabbi, each discussing the value of water in the tradition. And helping to elevate the conversation and making sure that people just act differently around their faith leaders. Sometimes the faith leaders can act as facilitators. The Coptic Church was tapped to play a role of mediation. This is true around the world. The Buddhist monks in Southeast Asia often are tapped to mediate. So I think reuniting these worlds of spirituality and rationality is a useful way to approach and remind us that water is not just another resource. This is the water law from New Zealand. And they did, with heavy Maori influence. This is the introduction. All things in the natural world have a life force and a spiritual dimension. Respect for spiritual integrity of the environment, and God that created it will ensure that the treasure can be protected and passed on to succeeding generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Wow. That's a wonderful introduction to dispute resolution and the water issues around the world. And you speak very clearly, and you're well prepared, and it's a delight to listen to you and have you with us today. Your growing smaller metaphor reminds me of 100 houses in Ottawa, Canada, in which the homeowners suddenly found themselves with cracking walls and views through spaces around their windows, and this finding out that their houses were all these houses were suddenly settled. And the city of Ottawa was busily putting in a deep sewer through their neighborhood. And so to do that, they had to pump the water out of the ground and make the excavation possible. And so these were the conflict between these house owners, 100 of them, and the municipality in their desire to put this sewer through. But no one was willing to agree with the other that they were responsible, or vice versa, for the problem. And what we found out was that Canada, where this was taking place, follows many of the common law parts of the British laws. The legal issues that we faced were based on common law from England. And the common law said, and you won't believe it, but what they said is no one knows where underground water comes from, and therefore no one can be held responsible. And secondly, that even if you pumped water out of the ground to get even with your neighbor for some reason or other, you still weren't responsible. So it was very strange to find out that these were the laws of the land at that time. And of course, the homeowners eventually went to the Supreme Court and had the law changed, that yes, we know a little bit more today than we did whatever it was 200 years ago. So it reminds me of that smallness. And the other thing that I would ask you a little bit about is what about what we could call fairness in the decisions being made? And is there anyone else up there, as we used to say, who looks at whatever these agreements are and saying that, well, one side was more powerful than the other, and therefore the resolution of this problem is unbalanced in that sense. So is there a kind of a fairness issue with many of these things that some third party could see?
Yeah. Yeah, no, you put your finger right on one of the more sensitive issues is, when we divide the world into conflict and cooperation, there's a school of London, a couple of scholars there, a guy named Mark Zaitoun and Naho Muromachi, and they wrote a lot what they call hydrohegemony, saying exactly what you just said. Not all cooperation is good. Sometimes these treaties that we're all very proud of cement power imbalances between the two parties. And I think that's true anytime. I mean, the power walking in the room, the power outside the room always exists within the room, regardless. So amongst facilitators, what we try and do on the very beginning of the process is we list how we're going to evaluate the agreement at the end. And what are the principles that we all want to strive for? And there we do justice, sustainability, equity. These are performance criteria that we'll list right up front. And then when we get to the end, we'll ask the group to come back and say, did we achieve these three things along with the things that, and sometimes that works. And sometimes it doesn't. I mean, at the end of the day, power is still power. And the question is, is a bad agreement better than no agreement? Some people would say yes, and some people would argue no.
Thank you for that. I just was curious, as I said, about the fairness of the result. And the other issue that I raised a little bit earlier is, of course, China, and China having the headwaters of many of that area of the world, India, Pakistan, whatsoever. And I read the other day, it's a statistic which I don't understand and can't believe it, that maybe you know better, is it said that China now has more dams in those waters. China has more dams than the rest of the world combined. Is that a reasonable statistic? And if so, China is now in control of the downstream use of that water by controlling it at the top. And one of the issues being raised is that China is now using this control of water and the statistics that they were giving out to India and other countries on whether or not they should anticipate floods downstream. And China is being very negative about this and trying to punish India, it's said, by not sharing this information with India anymore. Yeah. So is that that must be somewhat unique in the world of where one side is using water resources as a punishment.
Yeah. So I think, I don't know that China has more dams than everybody else. They may have more storage than everybody else, and that might make sense because they're damming up huge rivers and they have step dams. And so if you add all of that together, in terms of controlling what goes on downstream, the only thing that they can control is timing, right? They're not diverting the water in any of these dams. They're hydropower dams. And to be honest with you, what I've seen when I'm there, especially in Southeast Asia with the Mekong and working with Myanmar, is that they really increasingly are really interested in developing good relations with the downstream countries, because the dams aren't the only issue. They also want access to whatever's downstream. They want access to the fish, to the transportation, to the port, so there are a lot of benefits downstream that they see the need to Now, I don't know where you read about China and India. About a year ago, there was a group called, well, it doesn't matter because we're recording, but a group said kind of what you said, that China was doing on the Mekong, and they were holding back water. And it turned out China opened up all of their records and allowed scientists to poke around, and other scientists who weren't vested kind of found out that that was not the case. And the people who had the research group who had suggested China was manipulating data, they kind of had a vested interest for doing it on behalf of United States policy. So I would look outside maybe of the US to get a better sense of what China's doing, recognizing that there are some spins on how we're getting our China information.
Yeah, yes, I agree with a glass of water or something. Yes. Naomi, have you got a question of our speaker before we kind of go larger?
Thank you, Don. Is the UN involved in this, connected with their work on agriculture? And what would your take on that be if they are?
Oh, they're huge. So I don't know if you all know, next week in New York City is the first UN meeting on water since 1977. They're in the middle of a 10-year decade on water, and this is kind of their 5-year check-in. And that's why I'm here on this coast. Everybody who's involved in water is going to be in New York next week, and all the UN agencies are focused. UNECE has a treaty that they're trying to help people get. Absolutely, FAO, Food and Agriculture, deeply vested, because as you point out, the people who make the most water decisions are individual farmers. And what kind of decisions they make and how they make it scales up to have huge global influence. So the answer is yes. I think the UN is doing an awful lot. The World Bank is doing an awful lot. A lot of the, especially Northern Europeans, development partners are doing an awful lot. USAID is very hip. I think, I've been doing this, I guess, for 30 years. And I've just watched the attention to these issues and the investment in the issues and the integration between the different initiatives just grow year by year to a place where we might actually be able to accomplish something one of these days.
So you think we're making progress?
I hope so. Let me qualify that. I think we're making progress on the political front. I think, again, June started us off with some heartbreaking statistics, which don't change. I think the fact that the simple lack of safe, stable supply of water is driving migration, environmental degradation, suffering, death. I mean, just huge amounts of suffering. And so at the end of the day, the biggest thing we can do around water is quote, simple poverty alleviation, giving people the wherewithal to be able to generate the solutions where they are. And I think that's related but separate from the political impacts of that kind of suffering. So on the human and environmental impacts, I'm not very optimistic. On the political impacts, I'm increasingly optimistic.
Thank you.
Tyler, how
John,
about you, my friend?
yeah, Aaron, my question would be, to what extent do desalinization and wastewater conversion kind of hold a possible future solution to water scarcity out there? Obviously, you can't desalinize in the middle of sub-Africa, but in some areas, that's a longer-term solution given the financial, stresses that would cause.
Yeah, no, you touch on a really good point, Tyler. That in so much of the world, it's not a shortage of water, it's just shortage of resources. And so there's kind of a sequence of steps that you can take if you have the resources. And if you follow countries like Israel or Singapore, or Australia, you watch how they've done it. And so, early on, just moving from, say, flood irrigation to drip irrigation can save a huge amount of water. Then if you actually start to treat your sewage to a place where you can irrigate with it, now you're saving a huge amount of water. These are the incremental steps that really get places. And these are the first kinds of things that we in the US need to be doing, because we just don't. I mean, we use water the way we've used water for 1,000 years. Use it once and send it away. And then finally, once you've done these other cheaper things, then if you're on the coast and if it's drinking water and if the population is there, desalination may make sense. But this is hugely energy intensive. And so to make the fresh water takes energy. But then if it has to go somewhere other than the coast, you then have to ship it somewhere, and water is really big and heavy. So at the end of the day, if you were, for example, desalinating in the Central Valley in California, your tomatoes would cost $10 each, right? It just isn't economically viable. But if you happen to live in Santa Barbara and you're starting to run out of other sources of drinking water, and the population can afford to invest a little bit, then by all means, maybe that's a place where you would invest in it.
Thanks.
You got a follow up there, Tyler?
No, I said thanks.
Good for you. June, you were monitoring our Q&A, and I see that there is a question here, so I could read it if you like.
Now, let me just unmute myself here. I think I'm getting there. It says,
Yeah.
what do you think the most important policy issue is now related to water?
That's a questionnaire.
Yeah,
You don't want that one.
Yep.
that is just such a tough, if you had to do one thing, I think what I would do if anybody listened to me is I would look at the world's hotspots, because a lot of these places, and I mean hotspots not just in terms of scarcity, but where scarcity and poverty and political uncertainty all kind of come together. And so, in Central America, there are water issues that one of a contributing factor to just the real deep political turmoil that's also driving a lot of immigration northward towards Mexico and the US. And it's true also in Africa that there's a lot of hot spots in that part of the world where not only are people suffering and dying where they are, but it's also driving immigration northward. So I think that's what I would do, is kind of hone in on, like we do with pollution with the Superfund in the US. Find these really critical hotspots, 5 or 6 around the world, and just throw as much resources and as much planning and as much stability as you possibly can, using all the tools, using the diplomacy tools, the development tools, in order to help stabilize regions where they are, to help lower all the drivers that are causing people to suffer and eventually to move.
Who would be the lead agency on that? Would it be UN, World Bank? What do you think?
Yeah, so the World Bank next week in New York, they're going to announce something called the Water Cooperation Facility. And this is something that they're hoping to do, is at least facilitate dialogues in tense basins. I have a feeling that it really needs to be more hemispheric. So I personally, I think the US could be doing an awful lot more about development in Latin America. I think, the fact that we are on this side of the border and we complain and we have all these policies trying to keep people who are suffering out is one approach. But then thinking about how do you create a stable hemisphere where people don't feel that they have to pack their families up and try and make their way north. I think that's true, and probably on the European Union would do the same thing on the other side. So I think there are countries that are real vested in solutions. I mean, if you look at between the US and the EU, the investment that we're making with Ukraine and Ukrainian refugees, just the fact that this is happening, but it's a slower boil than Ukraine, I think still gives us some blueprints for how to help people where they are.
Thank you.
Do you see cases where what you want to do, your resolution or your movement of trying to move that forward is just not working? I mean, where is it not, people are not following what you want, or, are very reluctant to sort of want to work together?
Oh my gosh, all the time. I've discovered a real secret about human nature in this work, that sometimes people just hate each other. It's just going to be like that. And at the end of the day, what tends to happen is when you say doesn't work, it doesn't work for this round. But if we come back 6 months later, after having done some background and some kind of shuttle stuff, maybe we're able to move a little bit incrementally. But I've been working in Central Asia for 10 years. I think most of these agreements take about 10 years to get. So it's a very slow and incremental process, with a lot of people being very angry in the meantime.
So where would you say is the hot spot where you're really having difficulties? Where conflict is really on the edge, and it just seems as though you're having a very difficult time getting people to the table.
Yeah, it's where the enmities are deepest. So I think in the Ural Basin is Central Asia. These are all the kind of Ekistans and Afghanistan also, and China's invested, and Russia's invested, and the US has a lot of interest, and there's natural gas. I mean, it's never just one thing, and so it's a really hard place. That doesn't have a history of working together as independent states. They had great dealings when they were all under the Soviet Union. And I think that's true also in the Caucasus, where it's Azerbaijan and Armenia who have shot at each other recently. 6 months ago, they were shooting at each other, and no love lost between the two. But they have two rivers, the Kura and the Araks, that are both sides are dependent on, and they really have to collaborate in order to protect them, to protect the quality. And then the big ones are always ongoing. The Nile hasn't been resolved. Ethiopia still is building the dam, and Egypt is still objecting. I think Don brought up China. I think our relationship with China is going to have a real impact on China's international waters. Most of the downstream neighbors are U.S. allies, and this could play out. And it's not the first time. The first plan for developing the Mekong goes back to the 50s. The Bureau of Reclamation went and tried to recommend all these check dams, and it was explicitly a way to hold back communism and communist influence down into Southeast Asia. So that's where I get concerned, is where these kind of higher political issues start to interfere with people trying to problem solve.
Just as a little lighter note, I was thinking about the fact that an organization that I was fairly close to in Newfoundland, Seacorps, it's called, the Cold Ocean Research Engineering, and they were asked to see whether or not it would be possible to tow icebergs from the coast of Newfoundland down into the Caribbean. And so they were given this this money in order to start doing this research to bring drinking water, because the iceberg is fresh water, down into these areas. And so they tried to figure out how they could even tow an iceberg, and whether you lassoed it with a rope around it or something, cable, or tried to put an anchor in the iceberg and tow it along. And of course, icebergs are unstable in themselves, so they kept turning over, and there was no agreement between the iceberg and poor Sea Corps as to how to do this. So some of your resolutions kind of face this same problem that Sea Corps faced on how do you actually do this? And I wondered if there similar sort of off the wall ideas are coming to you and maybe your colleagues all the time in this idea of coming up with treaties between countries who really don't want to negotiate or to put together a package of some sort. In the middle of the night, do you wake up with a sudden idea as to what now?
There's no shortage of people who think that big tech is the way to go here, and to some extent it's true. Like I said, when you've done everything else, it may be that desalination is your last solution. But sure, I mean, I heard the Saudi Arabia was also looking at icebergs, and what they say, the barge would have to circumnavigate the globe 7 times, and then they'd have to nuke the Straits of Gibraltar to bring it into the Mediterranean. There was another great one. Apparently New York City has a big trash problem. So you put all of New York's trash on barges, and as these barges head towards the Middle East, they burn the trash and use that energy to desalinate, and you end up with a freshwater on the and then conveyance. You know, people have been talking from time immemorial, moving water from James Bay all the way as far as California. And when I was at school in Wisconsin, they were talking about moving water from the Great Lakes to California, and everybody was up in arms. Oh, we can't let them do that. Until I pointed out that the alternative was a bunch of Californians moving to Wisconsin, and then they were like, "Oh no, take the water. We'll help you build it." Yeah, there's no shortage of the vast areas, and I think all it does is divert attention from the real basic sets of issues. Is, you know, how do we use what we have better? How do we reuse? How do we recycle? How can we move towards greater efficiencies at the very, very local level? And then how do we help those scale up so that you don't have to build these massive pipelines?
Aaron,
So-
I'm sure you've noticed with more than passing interest, the atmospheric waves that have been kind of messing up California's climate. Very interesting. I mean, here we've had a conversion over a few months from pretty severe drought to excess. And yet, of course, as you know, an awful lot of that rain and snow melt are simply flowing out to the ocean. And it does raise issues about how municipalities and cities deal with water, which I'm sure you've been thinking about.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Also, the fact that climate change is mucking up all of our assumptions about stability. There's a good book called Let There Be Water that's about Israel's story in water management over the years, and they had to do all this step by step. And so I think California could learn an awful lot. And the kinds of tough decisions that they're going to have to make are not technical, they're legal. It's the first step is recognizing the connection between surface water and groundwater. The second is the whole water rights system has to be examined. But what Israel's done now is that they have basically they run their water system as if they were on a spaceship. Whatever comes in, if you're not using it for irrigation, you find a place to store it. You can store it in aquifers. You can store it in reservoirs. You can store it wherever you can store it. And then if it's raining in one place, you can move the water. Then when you recycle sewage, that's a whole separate piping system. You'll see a red pipe system that's only recycled waste, and that only goes towards agriculture. And so this idea of thinking very systematically around water as a closed system makes all the technical sense in the world, and there's huge efficiencies to be gained. The trick is you have to deal with the water rights system that's in place now. So a farmer right now may think, oh, I've got all these rights to use all the water I want, to grow all the crops I want. That's the part that has to be re-examined, hopefully in a way that everybody could win. If people were willing to invest in more efficiencies in agriculture, it may well be that farmers would be willing to negotiate rights in a way that could help to meet in-stream flow needs or storage needs or whatever else.
Aaron, you've been going well for over an hour, and we appreciate your
Wait, I have one more question, Don.
Now June has one more question, and then.
And I think you're touching on it. I think a question is coming in terms of sort of the US. How do we start? Is it sort of a local way of dealing with this, or how do we sort of move forward a more efficient and effective way of using our water and protecting it?
Yeah.
Is it local? It? Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Junie, I think the answer is yes. What I've noticed in the US, and I've worked with reclamation a bunch, and I'm working now with a little watershed in Central Oregon. And it's just the sweetest thing. You know, a lake went dry. Environmentalists showed up at the Capitol and said, hey, the lake's going dry. You got to stop the ranchers. The ranchers got word of this. They all organized together. And instead of going to court, they reached out and said, how do we have a conversation with the environmentalists? There's got to be ways we can work together to save the lake, to save the ranches, to save the environment. And they're entering into a conversation like that. And when that body now, literally this week, is going to the state legislature and say, we collectively need resources in order to do some gauging or do some plumbing, they get all the receptivity in the world because it's the entire political spectrum. And so I think that's where the local can then have an influence. But at the end of the day, especially if we're talking about a scale like California, you really can't move beyond the right system. At some point, we're stuck. The environment has rights through the Clean Water Act. Tribes have rights through treaty rights. Farmers have rights through reclamation rights, and all these rights overlap, and there just isn't enough water to meet all of the rights. So even if you have a lot of local collaboration, at the end of the day, you're still going to have to look at that right system and ask, how do we modify it in a way that nobody loses?
Great, thank you.
So can we wrap up, June? Where are we now?
I think so. Does anyone have another question for Aaron?
Aaron, what happens to us is that so many of our listeners, as it were, out there look at the tapes that we create. And so they have questions which are too late to come on as they watch you as the days go by now in the future. So that's one of the issues we have. And we're grateful. Thank you for being on the East Coast and joining in the deliberations with the United Nations and World Bank and others. We're glad you're there. You are bringing not only wit and charm to the issues, but also your knowledge and all the work that you've done in the past. So we are wonderfully happy to be part of you today, and thank you.
Thanks so
So
much.
Aaron, I totally concur. And Don, thank you very much for introducing us to Aaron. Aaron, I think we are semi-hopeful that the world will not blow up with each other over water. That if you can be facilitating all of these, we are very hopeful. I think your manner, your patience, you're willing to bring people together and work with them is admirable. It's far more patience than I could have. But anyway, you give us a great deal of hope. So also, I thank you And we will see another speaker in 2 weeks. On March 27th, we'll hear Ken Pollack. He is a senior fellow for the American Enterprise Institute, and we're going to be turning to the Middle East again. I don't know that water will quite be in it, but we know that that is an issue there also. We'll be talking about Iran's neighbors, including Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria. And I think since our last discussion on Iran, we see the alliance now between Iran and Saudi Arabia that was brokered by China, and also that Iran now has reached weapon-grade uranium. So I think there will be some very interesting discussions in 2 weeks, and I hope you will all join us then. So in closing, water is the essence of life. Maybe we will all realize how precious it is, take care of this as a resource that we treasure and do it together. So thank you all.
Okay.
So Joan?
Yep,
And you're wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron.
good. All right, thank you all. Thank you, Aaron. This was a wonderful presentation. Of course, I can't get out the image of them lugging an iceberg. It just as an image is now in my head. So thank you very much. And thank you for all this great information, and for June and Don for, of course, their great work. We'll see you all again in a couple of weeks. Bye, everyone.